Okay, should we begin? Yeah?
Yeah.
I think you already. So, welcome to this early morning session, hardly very early, but still feels like that almost to the speaker. I'm going to do something different to what you've been hearing so far, which is that I actually decided to summarize this topic called the history of education in South Asia, since I'm required to do that in the introduction to my section anyway. And that's the title of the section which I'm editing. And there are 6 chapters in it. And I'll go through the chapters so that everyone knows what they're like and can respond to them. But I'll also talk a lot about what I see as the themes for this section, and which I think are important to bring out. I'll try to relate it to what I've been hearing from everyone so far, because that I think is of value. And of course, I want to leave a lot of provocative questions thrown out so that you can ask about them and give me your feedback afterwards. So it might seem sometimes that I'm rushing through a lot of different kinds of ideas and theories and methodologies and all that, but it's a very rich field. The history of education in South Asia, like everything else, we wish we had more and we can see where the gaps are, but still it's a very rich field, and especially in the modern period when we come to the colonial and the nationalist periods. So with that, let me begin. And just want to say a quick word here, because it came up the first time when I wrote a draft outline or something. There's no ambiguity here about what is South Asia. South Asia means India. That's all it means, because historically speaking, that was the name given to that whole region. And the period that I'm looking at is only till 1947, 48, in some cases the 60s, which is when all these nation states became independent. So before 1947, it's completely synonymous to say South Asia or India. India does not here refer to the nation state of India. It refers to the larger geographical region. That's what it refers to. So there is a lot of debate about the periodization of Indian history. And one can't do away with the periodization, one can't do away with the chronology or the narrative of Indian history. And I have not done away with it. I will go through it, as you'll see. What is interesting here is, for me at least, to talk more about the themes and issues that cross-cut all these periods of Indian history. So these are some of them. The sociology, the politics, and the culture. That's how I divided it. So the sociology means the actual location in a site, who are the teachers, who are the patrons, who are the funders, and then who are the students. And also, of course, then you come to the politics, which is close to that, who is included in the student body or the teaching body or the patron body, and who is excluded from it, but therefore it doesn't mean that they're literally excluded. They're just doing other things, either in their own different places, which are central to them, or as subversion of the normative. And then the culture, which is partly my specific interest, is the relationship, as I put it, between the content of what is being taught, whether it's a text or it's always a text, whether it's oral or written or in the head of the teacher or whatever, it's always a quote-unquote text. So the relations between text, its meaning between the different participants in this endeavor and the larger world. And that's the culture of education, which we have to look at. It all may sound a bit abstract, but these, if you don't ask these questions, and I just wrote 10 questions there because I said this is getting out of hand now, so let me count them. There are only 10, there are no more than that, right? So if you ask these questions of any period, then you are likely to be able to get a pattern and not talk about the absence of this, or we don't know about that. Of course, you may not know that's a historiographical problem or a problem of data, but at least you'll have asked the questions right. So we have 3 periods. The first one is summarized as the Vedic, Buddhist, and classical period, and you ask these questions about them. The second one is the Sultanate and Mughal periods, and you ask these questions about that period. But you also ask a couple of additional questions, which are very well researched again, about the status of high Islamic knowledge, which is the knowledge called ilm, and the people who are the practitioners of it are called ulama. And there is a lot of information on that. And then you have the other kind of knowledge, which is parallel to it, but completely separate and not cross-cutting it, not even sometimes being acknowledged by it, which is that of Sufi knowledge. And that is an extremely powerful, dominant trend on the subcontinent. So these are two more questions. And I did write this down here because just for anyone who gets intrigued by this kind of partially a conflict situation between two different knowledge formations and two different educational enterprises, therefore, the Sufi and the ulamas. There's an excellent book, which is an edited book, much like ours will be, with scores of articles in it. But the difference is that it's all based on primary data. So each article only has a couple of pages of interpretation, and then it has an excerpt from whichever documents or whatever they're looking at. And that's Islam in South Asia in practice, deliberately so called, because it's about mostly the second kind of knowledge, which is oral knowledge or performative knowledge. And then the third period is the colonial and nationalist period, or sometimes called the modern period. And we have two more questions here, different to the other two. In this case, one is a more factual question about change versus continuity. And maybe you're aware that there's a big debate on that, whether colonialism really marked a break in Indian knowledge formations and epistemologies, or even the practitioners of the knowledge, or whether there was a continuity carried over by the British, the missionaries, the colonial state, the East India Company, and so on, from pre-colonial times. And sometimes this is even characterized as the former is the Chicago School, the latter is the Cambridge School, and there are very important historians who write about it and who have bred generations of students. And I think it goes to the heart of it, whether actually you're talking about a continuous kind of knowledge, it's just a different state that is in control of it, or you're talking about a real rupture and break. And the second issue, which is not factual as much as interpretive, is about the nature of the modern. Again, this is what I'm interested in, and it's not factual. I want to underline that. So you can't get at it through just finding more information about the indigenous or more information about modern schooling. It depends on the kind of conceptual framework you develop. It really depends on that. And in my case, what I have done is I've divided it into two things, which I'll be talking about the rest of the time: technology and politics. And as you'll see, when you look at these two things, these two separate things, but you look at both of them, not just at one, which is typically done, then you can ask some further questions about the nature of the modern. So here's my quick summary of the methodology. I'm certainly not taking education in the modern sense. I think that's a very, very narrow, specific sense of schooling, but it means actually the process of transmission of knowledge in different sites, whatever the sites are. We have lots of information historically about all the different sites that were used. And it can also consist of a variety of knowledge, but just to circumscribe it already by one kind of definition of curriculum, which is what arrived in South Asia in the middle of the 19th century, is problematic. So there are many, many ways of looking at this knowledge, but basically we can use our present vocabulary. It consists of vocational or liberal or body-related or ethical knowledge, and a combination of all of that. That's what it is. It's not really esoteric in any way. It all is understandable in these concepts. So let me look at my chapters, and this is the first one. This is the unwritten one, as everyone has in their sections, right? Not only unwritten, but if anyone knows someone who can write it, that would be welcome. Because in lieu of that, we'll have to do a very remarkable thing, which is that a historian of modern India will have to write this chapter on ancient India. I mean, I can write it, but I'm not the expert. But I can tell you what it should include when it's written, and if not, what I'll have to include either in the introduction or I'll decide how. So there are three sub-periods within the ancient period. One is the Vedic, then is the Buddhist, and then is the so-called classical or Hindu. And they're all totally different, with very different ideas of knowledge and education and teacher and taught and so on. But here the interesting thing is that there is a lot of discussion of Vedic knowledge formations and also who participated in its transmission, and of course Brahmins and all that. But the point is there were other parallel streams of knowledge which are called, we may call them folk or popular or secular or whatever, and they were not very different in terms of the power that they wielded. We should not, this discussion is very much germane to yesterday's, because something is not mainstream, it doesn't lack power. It has tremendous power for its practitioners. And they actually, if you were to focus on them, they discard the idea of mainstream. They don't think of themselves as marginalized. They don't think of themselves as on any periphery or whatever. They are the centers of their own universe. And this is important to remember here. Otherwise, we get drawn and sucked into this debate about Vedic knowledge and the status of the Brahman and all that, which is fine as long as you recognize that it's only one part of the story. In the Buddhist period, what is very important is the debate about participation of women, because it is a revolutionary movement. It does discard many mainstream ideas about society and ritualism and so on. At the same time, it is liberating in class terms, but not in gender terms. And there is really remarkable information on how women had to fight to get into any kind of monasteries or viharas and so on. And even then, in theory, they were totally marginalized. In practice, they of course are, but in theory also they are. So there's no way that a Buddhist nun is on a par with a Buddhist monk. Correct me if I'm wrong, but all the ethnographic data shows that they are actually relatively domesticated. They actually perform domestic duties rather than the knowledge-related duties, which is what they are supposed to be doing. This is saying the same thing, but let's go on to the classical period, which is what we all mean when we talk about Hinduism. We mean this period. We mistakenly might call the Vedic or the Buddhist or earlier periods that, but this is what we mean because this is when all those texts are written, which is what are alluded to, such as you know, the Dharma Shastra, the Artha Shastra, the Kama Sutra, many commentaries, the 6 philosophical systems, as well as lots of secular literature. And all these are fields of knowledge. They are actual disciplines of sociology, physiology, house building, and medicine, and the good life, and politics, and economics, and all that. And this, again, compare it to my earlier questioning, this is very useful, very interesting, as long as we know that they are just texts. They do not tell us with any guarantee that any of this was being practiced on the ground or was taken seriously. And as a comparison, you can think of, you can think of any text you like. You can think of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. Someone recovering that 2,000 years later is likely to worry about what must have happened if they just went by that text. And of course, as we know, something did happen, but not what the text says should happen, right? So there is a should. This is how things should be in all these texts that are written. So I think we should speculate. This is what I'm trying to emphasize here, that there is a kind of questioning that's gotten inbuilt into the transmission of knowledge in South Asia. And that questioning is what is really important. And so if you apply it to this period also, you can be pretty sure that there was a steady questioning and criticism of the texts, which we have come down to us, but not the questioning. And there are lots of readings of these periods. Feminist I've already mentioned in terms of the Buddhists, but Dalit readings also. Here is one thing to take away from this ancient period, that there are two sources of power regarding knowledge. One is the commitment of the teacher, the dedication of the teacher really to the student. And the second is the dedication or commitment of the student, meaning actual man hours spent in laboring over the process of studying. And of course, as we know, in the system, it used to spill over into doing a lot of other kinds of physical work, which is, fine. That's always what is presented and caricatured and made a fuss about, but you forget that actually there was a lot of studying going on, and this was on top of all that. So why is that important? Because it's important because at present, one of the dilemmas of education is that there is this inequality in all South Asian systems, and that one of the reasons given for that is that children are not all the same. It's maybe not overtly said, but there is the implication that some children cannot study as well as others. And often it's the individual child who is blamed in a classroom or a school situation, but often it's the family background that's blamed. And there are some kinds of parents or families that cannot be considered good parents because their children can't study, something like that. It's very, very poor and faulty essentializing of children without giving them a chance by giving them equal opportunities to actually see if they indeed can study or not. My proposition is that in the South Asian educational concept of philosophy, there is no essentialism. You have scores of mythological stories in which asurs or the demons are studying side by side with devs or the gods, and anyone could study. They just had to have that motivation. I want to study, and people go traveling over miles and acres to find the right teacher, or they change their teachers at the drop of a hat because one doesn't seem the right one for them. And then students become so wise and learned that they are better than the teachers, and the teachers can humbly come and say, now you teach me, and all kinds of permutations are possible, but there is no characterization of a kind of student as being the right student who can study. So this is very, very important, because I think this is a hidden or now a substratum discourse in South Asia, which is available to anyone who wants to bring about a change in South Asian education. You just have to tap into this discourse. It's in the back of everyone's mind that, of course, every child can study because they know enough stories about it. It's just that it's not practiced, so you think, well, maybe I'm wrong, maybe they can't. The next chapter, which is being written by Usha Sanyal, and a very wonderful scholar who has published a lot on madrasas, and I commissioned her to look at Islamic education in general, from the coming of Islam to South Asia, right up to our cutoff date. So she, again, first she talks about the ulama or high education, which is what is there in these two kinds of the elementary institutions and the higher institutions of learning, maktabs and madrasas. And they were not just plentiful, that's just a word I've thrown out there. They were very actively patronized, built up. As soon as the Muslims settled down anywhere, they had the mosque and they had a madrasa. They had a mosque and they had a madrasa, and they had a library, and they had many, many centers of learning and exchange of knowledge. So she's looked at all that. And then she has looked at what she really studies, which is this business of reform on the one hand, but also this business of the second kind of knowledge, which is a rival order of knowledge, that of the Sufis. Now here's something interesting about this. It's closely related to the spread of Islam debate. Here's the importance of education. Education is apparently the source of the numbers of Muslims that are in South Asia. Education meaning a very wide understanding of education, carried to all the corners of South Asia by Sufi teachers, peers they were called, murids, and they took on the roles of mentor and guide, including in practical matters, meaning in canal building and agriculture, and as therapists and so on for family and social issues and so on. So the very wonderful literature, especially on Bengal and on the Punjab, but some about South India also, tells us how these Sufi teachers specifically were looked upon as teachers. That's what they were called. They had khankas, they had little centers of learning where people flocked, and apart from that, they traveled. So they moved around, they mixed with the population, and apparently this is the main reason for the spread of Islam and for the prevalence and power of Islam, especially in Bengal, especially in northwestern India. Here I've made a little point here that, as in the other practices described earlier, there is a coming together without any agony or self-questioning of the vocational and the ethical. By ethical, I mean, I think we can translate it in modern day terms as a liberal arts education, where you just learn what it means to be a human being in the world of your time, and how you relate to others, and how you should think about values and so on, from a very diverse kind of source of information. That's what ethical means. And vocational means, what is my career path, and what should I be learning to do? This is the name which is given to this kind of theory of the spread of Islam, syncretism. And so it relates to another debate, which is about the Hindu-Muslim relations on the subcontinent, which goes on its own narrative and trajectory. It's a whole different history and historiography. But it's very closely related again to education. Because if you look at the upper class versions of knowledge, that's called classical knowledge, and at the level of high classical learning, there's the Brahmins and there's the ulama, and they stand face away from each other. They have nothing in common and no desire to have anything in common. But if you look at the other kind of learning, and Sufis is what I mentioned, but I threw out Bhaktis, the Bhakti movement and Bhaktas and all that. So there is a complete parallelism there, and at this level of everyday or folk knowledge or popular knowledge or village culture or popular culture, whatever you want to call it, the philosophies and practices of Hindus and Muslims are actually similar, resulting in similar worldviews. And there are umpteen studies of texts, genres, performances, and all kinds of everyday rituals and everyday life practices which attest to this. So again, I'm not saying this is an open and shut case. There's a debate about it. Many people, when I say this, if this was a different audience, there'll already be a simmering amongst many to say, how dare you say this especially about Islam. But I'm talking about I'm mentioning the debate, but I'm talking about what I think is quite powerful in terms of its evidence. So what are the exclusions here, and how does power work within this knowledge system? So I've already mentioned that you could look at the popular as as something targeted by the normative. It is targeted. There are waves of reforms. 3 of them are that by the Barelvis, the Deobandis, and Ahle Hadith movements. Each of them has a literature of its own. And Usha Sanyal, who's writing this chapter, has written very beautiful books on the Barelvis, especially, and girls' education within that, on top of it. So this reform targets all the practices of Islam at this level as wrong, and therefore to be criticized, and wants to reform them. So there's this whole fundamentalist kind of movement within the history of education. But the other exclusion is that in this high normative knowledge system, there is no presence of women. They teach at the local level. So if you go around in any town or city, there will be Maulanis who will be teaching girls the Quran at home. There are plenty of Maulanis, and they are the parallels of Maulanas. But that's all. They don't reach anywhere else, and they don't preach or sermonize. But in popular Islam, women are very, very active, and they are actual, the parallels of doctors or therapists or mentors, psychologists, and they sit in different locations and they actually pronounce judgment on problems and give ideas about how to understand anything. They're like teachers, well-established teachers. So there's a new division that occurs in the colonial period, and that's between the Ashraf, which are the high classes, upper castes among the Muslims, who devise new institutions and curricula. Sayyid Ahmad Khan is a perfect example of this kind of a person, and their leadership is very, very wonderful because they do manage to reflect on the actual problems being experienced by Muslims under colonialism and bring together in a very rich synthesis what they think is completely inviolable in the Islamic principles, but marry it to the science and European learning that they think Muslims should also pursue. But that's only the Ashraf. At the same time that this is happening, all the working classes and lower classes are left to their same status as before. They are not exposed to any kind of European learning or modern education, and their learning continues in madrasas of the same type. And that last point which I made, I just want to say it's not a religious problem. It's not a problem of Islam. It's really something to do with the economic status of people who are at the bottom of the ladder and who are regarded as a captive working force who can be used very cheaply, but as long as their education remains incomplete. Oh, I do want to mention this here. I just spotted it, that I have worked with such people. You know, my first focus of study was on the artisans, who are Muslim artisans in North India. And my whole first work is a celebration of their knowledge, both ethical and vocational, and their perfect rootedness in their world. It took me many years or even decades to see that they were this kind of captive working class, which I have said, you know, so they were wonderful. For themselves, they claimed to be happy, they claimed to be satisfied and in every sense content with their lot, and they were deeply knowledgeable, but they are actually discriminated against. This chapter, The Colonial Period, is written by Tim Allender as well as Catriona Ellis. So they have written two different chapters and they have two different takes on it, because this is not one narrative. Actually, there are four narratives within the colonial period, and we don't have anything on missionary education per se. That's fine. I can cover it in the introduction. But in this, the first one by Catriona Ellis, she gives an overview of the literature and education, and that's very good in itself. But both she and Allender, they are very up to date in their take on this. So rather than engage in rather old and tired debates about the power of colonialism versus the power of nationalism, and you know, I'll just tell you about that a bit more. Rather than that, they look at much more nuanced things about what was going on in education, and that each side is actually can be broken up into many, many, many different perspectives within it, both colonial and nationalist. So when I say they are critical of both the subaltern studies model and the subaltern studies model, actually by its very terminology means there's the elite and the subaltern, and they don't go further to, they do in practice, but not in their first statement of their purpose, about how the subalterns are actually not just one category, but there are many, many different things. And in the case of provincializing Europe, which may be familiar to you as again, supposedly a path-breaking work by Dipesh Chakravarti, here the problem is that it's the West against the East. And the point really of all these scholars is, such as the ones writing for this volume, is that the territory of India is not categorizable as one. And there are all these different differences within that, which are much more interesting than just the difference with Europe. Oh, can I take 10 minutes more? Yeah. So in this is the first main narrative. Everyone knows about Macaulay, but that doesn't mean that you don't need to cite him. So he's cited by everyone, including in these chapters. And it's important because it's all about educational policy. The policy that has been made then and continues till today is that indigenous knowledge systems are vastly inferior, and that Indians could become British, replace that with modern or global in taste and intellect. They just won't change in blood and color. He uses all these terms. And that the key to this is education. Those are the 3 parts to the thesis. All right, so this is one topic or one narrative. It's not the only one. Because the other side of the coin is that just by wishing it, you can't do it. And if Macaulay couldn't do it, and 4 generations of people under the in the colonial period after that couldn't do it, we should not expect that we can do it, because actually the colonial state had more hegemony, in a sense. It had more power. It had much more experience of building up a nation state, from the example of England. So the problem that happened was that it was not only a lack of political will, but also a kind of incompleteness, which happens when you don't have enough funding, when you don't give enough funding. That's the bottom line of the failure of the colonial mission in India. They never gave the amount of money to schools, which they themselves recorded very meticulously, and it's all available as evidence against them, that was required. So there is the case of Bombay University that I've looked at. It never actually, according to its own faculty and its own administration, had enough money for its science courses, or its science teachers, or its labs. But apart from that, look at all the small towns and all the provincial places. They were completely left out in the cold. And inspector upon inspector who visited them said, our great experiment is failing, and there's no way it will be completed, and it's just a crazy enterprise. They used every stark kind of definition. So we have to remember that the public policy or the educational policy that was launched and then proved unsuccessful did so for very specific reasons. So this is what I've called it technology, when I've said you need the funding, you need the labs, you need the classrooms, you need the teaching skills, you need the trained teachers. And that's what you need. There's a complete parallel in the complaint of the science people and the humanities people. The science people know that there are not enough resources, and the humanities people think, and they also think that humanities is being promoted because it's cheaper, and the humanities know that there is no system to actually teach English, and it's just in name and not in fact. Very important 2 takeaways from missionary education in the colonial period. One is that they actually started the best schools. Those schools have been the model for all good schools. And when public schools, so-called, became the norm as elite schools in South Asia, they actually built a lot upon the example of the missionary schools. For the longest time, any listing of the best schools, the excellent schools in South Asia, would be mostly the missionary schools. They did that because they wanted to convert the elite, in which they succeeded. But the other thing which they did, which was an example for the nationalists, was that they worked very hard with the poor also, and they set up chains of schools. So as we'll see when we come to nationalism just now, that's what our own people did also. So here are some important debates, all to do with education, all right? So this is the masks of conquest idea, that English teaching was introduced into India because it was simpler to use English as a tool, soft power and all that, than to use armies. And it worked. And English was first elaborated in India as teaching medium and as a language that ought to be respected and studied, even before it was in England itself. These 2 are, should I give you the names of who's responsible for these ideas? That's Gauri Vishwanathan's. Bountiful Tree is Dharmpal, political agenda is Krishna Kumar. And this is the idea that our wonderful indigenous systems of education were wiped out by the British. The colonial construction is Bernard Cohn's idea. Producing India is taken over by so many scholars after him. It's a very, very powerful construct. The idea that it was mostly colonial discourses that constructed the ideas that we now hold to be indigenous and classical and ancient and particularly Indian, right? The empire and information ideas that of Chris Bailey, the Cambridge school that I mentioned earlier, which is that there is a continuity of knowledge and information, and the same kind of people continue to work. They just switch from one state to another, one loyalty to another. This is my idea, which is that actually you can privilege the community, but after a point you have to realize its own politics, which are as deadly as that of the nation state. So you can't gain much by looking only at communities. You should look at the poor this and the poor that and the marginalized this and so on. But within them, again, there's a lot of hierarchy and a lot of domination. So that is as important as anything else. This is something which we have to really, really think about, that we think that indigenous education vanished in the sense that schools for it vanished. It continued at least almost up to the present, till 1 or 2 generations ago, in the families of every South Asian. Every South Asian person, no matter which colonial type, modern type school they went to, first learned the languages of their mother tongue or classical language group, every single one of the hundreds and hundreds that I've looked at. And at the same time, of course, language is not just a language. Language is like a culture. You learn the whole culture and epistemology through a language. So they were exposed to a completely different worldview and narratives in their early childhood. So that's the only explanation for why people like Surendranath Banerjee, Aurobindo Ghosh, and dozens of others, these three, are just my uncles, whom I know privately as being part of the same kind of situation, and I can tell you about that later. But all of them, they follow a kind of arc. They have their early childhood education till 5, 7, 8, whatever. They go to a colonial school for 10, 12 years to college and university. They graduate from Oxford or Cambridge or wherever. They enter law or whatever secular kind of very modern profession, and they are exemplars in that profession. But then at the end of the day, upon retiring or upon seeking early retirement, which much of them curiously did, many of them did, they then go into a deep study of guess what? The Upanishads or the Vedas or the epics, and they sit there at the end of their lives working it out that who am I really, you know? So this kind of, this is what I call indigenous education. This is what should be one of, I think, our basic understandings about South Asian education, which is that Indian modernity, Indian education, by which I mean South Asian, is not singular as elsewhere, it's plural. Every South Asian person belongs to plural worlds, plural epistemological and sociological worlds. And one might be in the school, university, or workplace, but the other one might be at home or in other spaces. But they are perfectly comfortable. It's not a detriment to them, it's not a problem or an issue or some crisis to be resolved. It's perfectly good, a way of being as any other way. Then we come to the next chapter on nationalist education. Here it's a case study of one university, actually Banaras Hindu University, but the way she has developed that chapter, she's brought in all the issues of Lee Reynolds, is her name, of all the issues of nationalist education. Because, of course, nationalism went through many, many phases and it tried many things. But this is probably the more interesting thing. When they set up institutions of their own, which they called by interesting names as Anglo-Vedic, and many of them were called Hindu, many of them were called Muslim. This is all the power of naming. It didn't mean anything in reality. They were just given those titles. And then at the local level, there were thousands based in caste and community. Each one of them was striving to be outside the colonial fold, somehow produce a synthesis between what is most precious in their own tradition and what they want to adopt from the West. This is the one agenda of all of them. And it's not an agenda that has gone away. We might be now immune to it because it seems overfamiliar and old. But actually, it's the most powerful agenda here. Why did they fail? Because I'm going to claim that these people failed. And I'll, how do you judge failure? Maybe somewhere here, I've written here. Yeah, here. If you use a certain criterion of success, which is their criterion, that they want to have a new Indian system of education that would bring together the best in Europe and India, by this criterion, none of them succeeded. Because today, those that exist are just average, run-of-the-mill, completely unremarkable institutions. And of course, some vanished or some became worse than this even. But the point why they did that is because they did not use any technology. Their politics of opposition was fine, it was great. But I think one of the things to look at in terms of education is, again, coming back to the funding, to the resources, to the training, and so on. So they rather mechanically replicated colonial approaches. If you look at all the archival data of when they're founding a school and when they're debating about the school, they're saying, well, anything will do, let's have this type of building, or let's hire so-and-so as the principal. They don't look at it in any detail or any depth. That's not where their interest lies. Their interest lies in the overall idea and the idea of opposition. BHU is a perfect example of that. It's got all these faculties of Indology and Vedic this and Indian music and all that, but those are unimportant. They're just like any departments anyway. The really important ones are science and engineering. Those are the only ones that count. And right away in its first few decades, that's where the people flocked, and that's where the money went and the interest went and everything. So they didn't know what they were doing. By just adding on a few departments, you don't create a different kind of a system. So let me just end by, I do have another chapter, which is the modern subject. This is, it's the end of the presentation. It's the chapter by me. And here, I'll just quickly mention some of my thesis, that you have to see that they exercised agency, even in Sanskrit education, where actually the British seemed to take over the whole territory, and the Pandits, at least in some places, were completely disenfranchised and didn't have the power that they used to. Even there, I want to say that they exercised their agency. They could have done something else, but they chose to do it like this. And the case of English is very, very interesting, because actually a lot of people actively steered clear of it. They didn't want to get into it, since it only was good for certain kinds of jobs, and they were not looking for those kinds of jobs. And then I mentioned this about plural education and about being a captive working class. Here's the last of my thesis, which I want to bring to your attention. It's, I call it the performance thesis, and it's by, very well presented by two people. One is Sanjay Srivastav, who's written about the Doon School, and in his study, he shows how through various kinds of self-expressions, including secular rituals of everyday life, the elite in a school like that consciously construct their identity by distancing themselves from the masses, and by labeling those masses, much as if they were another species or another race and not part of the same nation, labeling them as backward in different ways, or illiterate, superstitious, whatever you might want to call it. It's very eloquent study and very well done. And Weiner, a much more direct study through interviews, shows that Indians are just hierarchical and they don't want change because they like the privilege that they have. And this has been much criticized. Mostly because, as I said, it's not that only the elite want power, everyone wants power. Our mythology teaches us that everyone does, and they're always struggling for power. This story, particularly of Shukracharya and Kutch, is one that I like to relate a lot, because it tells us, it's actually a reflection on teachers and teaching, on how the teacher will not teach everything to the student, will reserve a little bit. So what he reserved was that one bit of knowledge about how to bring the dead back to life. And it cost him dear, because there was a time when he had to die and then be revived, and then at the last minute he imparted that knowledge to Kutch so that he could be brought back to life. So everyone knows that knowledge has power. And I will say that the last different thing about Indian modernity is that, and here's the performance going on here also, modern Indians act as if they've now discovered the child, right? They're ready to consume for the child and ready to exhibit the child, much like you would exhibit any commodity you were consuming, but they are not ready to accept that a child is actually an individual with their own agency and choice. So at this point, we can end and say that this whole thing still eludes us, because it's really a lot to do with this hidden discourse, which we have not had enough discussion or debates on. And we need to have these debates, because we would have to give up a whole lot of stuff and learn. We have to objectify our culture. We have to actually look at it dispassionately and study it and reflect on it, not just live it as we are doing very happily at present. I mean, I included. Thank you.
I just wanted to question the idea at the beginning that it's, you talk about South Asia as India, but what about the other countries that have a different history, like Maldives, Myanmar, Sri Lanka? Just troubles me a little bit if you're using the label South Asia and then it's really about India.
Well, India is just a name for South Asia. That's what I'm trying to say.
Not the history of the Maldives is quite different to that.
If Maldives was not part of the British Empire, which they called India, which included Myanmar, Afghanistan, and all the other countries, but just Maldives I'm not sure about. But it definitely included all the other countries that we are talking about, and they called it India.
My question is just about the same. At the very beginning, you defined South Asia to be India. And when you are defining the history of education, up until what time is this period? Is it till the 1940s that you're...
Yeah. 1948 till the independence of Sri Lanka, 48 till the independence of
that's okay.
Other place, and 47 India.
Yeah, but we were an identity in Sri Lanka, and we do have a history in education, and I'm just wondering, when you are writing like this, whether that actually is the correct reflection of the history of education in South Asia.
Everywhere that I say India, I can replace it with South Asia, and nothing will change. Instead of saying India, I'll just say South Asia each time. That's fine, because there is a possible confusion between present-day India and historical India. So you can't keep saying historical India each time. One might as well say South Asia, that's fine. But the history is in common. The coming of Islam, the trade, the colonialism, the different regional kingdoms, the economies, that's all looked at as one history of South Asia. South Asian history is a field of knowledge by itself. So we can say South Asia or we can say India. All scholars agree, all scholars without any exception agree that the historical name for South Asia is India. It's not to be confused with present-day India. That's a different India, and historical India is South Asia.
So you mean to say throughout the chapter you would now write this as India or South Asia?
I don't care if it bothers anyone. I can write
it would bother me. Yeah, seriously, because if you are writing about the history of education in India, this would be fine. But then, if it is India, then it should be reflected as India, because well, we do have a history of education, especially in the monastic education and so on. And even if you don't, write about that, I still think that some identities would have to be maintained of the other.
Monastic education is in common in South Asia. The best studies are actually of East India, East South Asia, as much as of South Asia.
Okay.
Thank you. I think this is going to be an excellent contribution to the debate. And I really look forward to reading it, because you were skimming through some excellent slides there. And I think for me what's emerging is that your paradigmatic orientation challenges the notion of a singular truth. And I think that's what some of the questions are coming about, as if there is a single truth, that truths are really constructed and deconstructed and engaged with in elements of power. And I think that's what strongly, for me, comes through this particular section. History is not a kind of codification of a truth as if it singularly exists, but it is something that will constantly be lived and critiqued and communicated. And I like that's what you're summarizing in this particular section. So I think it points to all the authors in the way in which we write our chapters, whether we kind of complicit with an agenda of essentialism, whether we actually writing as if to create an idea that there's a uniqueness and a singular definition of what is the truth. And I think what your section is going to do for the handbook as a whole is argue for us to be self-critical about whose truths are we actually labeling, converting, adopting in the way in which we write. Because all of us equally come with an epistemology in the way in which we write our different chapters. So I just want to congratulate on a really provocative sense of opening up the debate about this. And this is not only true to South Asia. It's or how we define any category, region itself. We might ask the same question about the United States or the Americas or the Southern context. Each of these are constructions of history, and history is not about the past, but history is about how the present understands its past in order to project its future. So, and I think by taking that conception that we have a much greater possibility through the theorizing of this section. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Very complex presentation. It will take some more time for us to churn it out, but just following up on Rhonda's and Deepti's comments, like, I mean, if you look at South Asia as a space, you know, was India the term that was used? I mean, in terms of, you know, anciently, or I mean, is it a creation of colonialism? Like, because I mean, the word that we use for South Asia in the past is Bharatvarsh or Hindustan. Yeah, I mean, that gives us a better understanding of this whole this subcontinent rather than India, which is also, you know, I mean, which is also like used as a nation state. So, and then the effects of, you know, like, for example, like the effects of Islam or the effects of Buddhism, when we look at South Asia as a space, I mean, it has varied across the different spaces that now constitute South Asia. We were just talking about Maldives yesterday, yeah? And then like Maldives was a Buddhist country, you know, before the invasion by Islam a few hundred years ago. So, and then like in Nepal, we had, you know, Islamic invasion, but Nepal never had that sense of, you know, I mean, knowledge traditions in the Islam. So as a space, South Asia, you know, like these traditional forms of knowledge, they have had various effects in various places spatially. And something, if that could be, you know, I don't know, like how the presentations will cover on that. And the second relates to the issue of nationalism, you know, like it took a specific discourse in each of the nation states after the independence. Yeah? But then if you look at all of the other nation states than India, the nationalism discourse that started, for example, in Nepal or in Pakistan or in Bangladesh, yeah, is in a sense counter to Indian nationalism. So how do we then talk about that?
Well, it's up to all the chapter authors to talk about that. In my section, I'm talking before independence for every single country. So it's a historical chapter, and it ends where independence begins, because then that's contemporary times, as far as I'm concerned. And so...
I would not think that independence is the singular point activated that you can only sense of nationalism, because it will also have its historical legacy. No?
That's what
Like just like the caste system. I mean, we say like in Nepal, it was introduced in 240 years ago, but I mean, it's not exactly 240 years ago, you know. There would have to be a whole basis for which the caste system then would have to be legally promulgated. So in that sense, even the history of nationalism would not really start with the independence. I mean, there would have to be a long, you know,
continuity is actually no argument for making some kind of periodization. There could be continuity between periods, very, very profound continuity. The point is that all these boundaries are artificial ones, whether temporal or spatial, so they are drawn by someone at some time for some reason. And the boundary for so-called South Asian history is drawn like that, that it actually, you know, you then do contemporary stuff after, at least that's what historians think, right? And they don't say there is a separate history of Nepal or a separate history of any place, unless you want to make a specific point about the region, and even then it's part of the whole history of South Asia, which I'm saying is called India. Historically, South Asia has just got that name in all the history books and in all the history literature. It's nothing to do with the politics of nationalism or post-independence nation states. That's a completely different area which historians don't get into. They just don't get into it. And I think there are, of course, tremendous continuities, but it's maybe up to the chapter authors to see what those continuities are. I mean, I think my task, as I see it, is to lay out all these different, through particular methodologies which are spelled out, all the different narratives, and what is at issue in them, what is important or interesting, why should we look at the history at all. And then if you think it's useful or interesting, it can be tied up to your different chapters. If not, then it stands alone. It's just a description of the history. Yeah?
Yeah, the sweep and the complexity of the section is few. And I personally got quite a few insights, and I have to mull over it substantially as well. But one point that immediately comes to mind is, see, you pointed out the kind of essentialism did not exist largely in the South Asian context. But then you are also saying that to be able to study this, we should objectify our culture. So my question is primarily critical theorists, for example, question this idea of objectifying what we want to study. So in a way, it tends to essentialize what we study, just because we need to mark the boundaries and develop constructs around it. So there is this danger of essentialization through an objective study. So I was wondering if it's possible to study this deeply from a more subjective point of view, through lived experiences, as it were.
So what I meant by objectifying culture, let me give you just an example or two. Take caste, for instance. I think that it's the lived-in experience of many people in South Asia, that their family has some kind of an inherent understanding of caste, which is just there. It just exists there. No one talks about it and brings it up or anything. It's not even interesting enough for a discussion, but it's there. And what that understanding rests on is, this is who we are. We are this. And it's some kind of a unarticulated history of the family, of that larger community. And these are the things that our family members did, and because this is who we are and this is how we do things. That's what it rests on. I think this is a very important thing, and by discarding very correctly the idea of caste discrimination, we have maybe thrown this, using that cliche, the baby out with the bathwater, because it's the heart of our history. We should know about caste histories. We should know not merely from archives, from our own families. We should all be writing family histories and be very interested in them. Not think, oh, I don't believe in caste, so I can't do it. It's not anything to do with a belief in caste. It's a fact. It exists. It existed. So you sociologically should be interested in it. That's what I meant by objectification. And once you have, then you know where you stand, because it's perfectly fine to study something or to relate to it and not practice the discrimination that comes with it. You know, they're completely different things. And partly it has to do with our post-nationalist politics, the Nehruvian era, and the direction that our education has taken. But our education has this big missing gap. We don't actually talk about the hierarchies in our society as if they are fine, we can deal with them. It's all pushed under the carpet. You know, no one can mention that word.
I think that the response to the question actually shows, even within complexity theory, there are different variants about how to go about the approach methodologically about doing the research. So your recommendation is objectifying to be able to create that distance and understand where the legacy comes from, rather than go with a kind of hermeneutic, interpretivist kind of approach. So I'm saying that very often what's happening in the way in which we write about ourselves, we're not standing back and asking what is our epistemology. And I'm just saying that the chapter should allow that possibility to say there are various options of looking at ourselves and how we research ourselves and what frames we bring to bear. And I would say that the orientation to this chapter, this section, would be strengthened if it made explicit those options that you just declared now, and make it a possibility to ask what kinds of ways in which we do research and the way in which we construct research, because very often we tend to draw on particular sources of data, ways of reading those data as well. So I think the methodological contribution of the chapter might be a very powerful contribution.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is very well taken. It would refer to the chapter that I am writing on, the modern subject, right? And not the overall section. Yeah.
Ma'am, my question is from indigenous education. You did mention about it. And you said people like Surendranath Banerjee and Aurobindo Ghosh, why do most brilliant students disown their education? So, but if we see in today's world, ma'am, like one of the example is Auroville, which signifies universalism and international harmony, which cut across boundaries. So, what are your comments on it? Like, brilliant students still, they disown the, their education, it's still valid in India.
Well, my comment about disowning education was about the educated classes of the historical India, right? Not about present-day Auroville at all. So historically, as I try to give a quick example of all these various educated people, Surendranath Banerjee wrote prolifically, so we have his words, what he said when he was 30 and what he said when he was 80, right? And you can tell that the man recreated himself, he reinvented himself, and he discovered something which took him his whole life, to finesse. And Aurobindo Ghosh's is an even more clear example and dramatic example, because in his case, his father decided that my son is going to be not a Bengali, but completely an Englishman. And so he saved him from all kinds of Bengali influences as he saw it, kept him with a nanny, kept him in Loreto, Darjeeling, sent him to England and all that. But when Aurobindo Ghosh became an adult, he discarded all that and he decided that he was, of course, he also failed in some exam or the other, but then he decided that he was going to search for what he thought was the valid knowledge. And he pursued that for years and years and years, and he became an icon. But his starting off, and how could he do that? There is a missing period of exactly 7 years in his life, from 0 to 7, when we know that he was under the influence of his mother, who was a very powerful lady and who had all kinds of knowledge that she could transmit to him just by hint or clue or indirectly. And it all was lodged in his head. It doesn't have to be something that you read in a book. I mean, Gandhi does read many books and therefore comes to some understandings. But even he acknowledges his past. Every one of them, even if they give half a page or 1 page in their memoirs, they all talk about the first influence in their lives. And that is a hidden story of Indian education, this plurality, that actually every Indian is also formed in the home and the family and through mostly mother figures, not literally mothers, but mother figures. And then they realize at some point in the future that in their later lives that their colonial education was not the whole story. And that's why I mentioned my uncles. I was really amused, one after the other. As they retired, they started writing, translating from Sanskrit and quoting verses from various epics and sitting there, musing over old philosophical tracts. People who had been engineers or judges, high court judges their whole lives and were like the image of the anglicized South Asian person. So I mulled over this for decades, what's going on here? What kind of education should we say they're having? And there's no other explanation for so-called cultural continuity in the South Asian countries. The continuity arises from the fact that there's an actual transmission of knowledge from generation to generation, which is not objectified. That means it doesn't have a curriculum, it's not taught anywhere, but it's passed on very successfully so far. And now there's a break for various reasons, but that is part of the story of education, the history of education. Without that, we won't be able to figure out much that goes on. So by disowning, that's too strong a word. I just meant going beyond.
Kind of reflecting on both. When initially you explained your use of the term India and linked it to this naming of the South Asian region, I quickly dived into that usage of the term and swam with it. But listening to colleagues and their own reading of the term, I'm thinking whether it's important to go back and reflect on which term we will use. Because I think the readership of this handbook is going to be very diverse and very likely very few trained historians will come to this handbook to seek these insights. It will be largely read by the education community. And I expect that the same tension and discomfort and ability to relate to the chapter will come because of the words that we're using. So I'm wondering what will we lose if we use the term South Asia instead of India? Because I think you're rightly pointing out that even this region, which today we call the nation state of India, was in fact in the past never recognized as a single nation state. There were kingdoms, there were regions. It's a very fractured, and in that sense, when we look at the physical map, we can see the much more complexity of different political units when they rose, when they ended, what influences were exercised. So the term India itself seems to be acquire a certain solace. It consolidates with the naming and the processes, the kind of research that the colonial period undertook. And in the historian community, there's an understanding of how to use this term. But would we lose some of that if we use the term South Asia instead? Or do we need to just re-educate much more strongly or enable the reader to understand it with more effort?
I think South Asia is a very narrow term for the purposes of this section. Because actually we are talking about knowledge systems and educational systems that have other characterizations. So classical, Vedic, Buddhist, and so on. They go beyond, they travel a lot, and they start in one place, they move somewhere else, or Islam for that matter, and then it comes back, or it's challenged somewhere, or whatever. And I'm hoping that it's all that nitty-gritty empirical stuff that will be much more valuable and impressive. And it's only, as many people have pointed out, only in the colonial period that it becomes an Indian empire. Before that, it's the Sultanate, it's the Mughal Empire, the Gupta Empire, the Mauryan Empire. So these are nothing to do with either India or South Asia. It's only in the colonial period that it becomes that. So for that period, we can bracket it, that's what the British called it. because all the data calls it that. Every single thing, you can't change the data, you can only change how you write, and most of the historians have changed it, like Barbara Metcalf talks about Islam in South Asia, or Chris Bailey talks about South Asia, or Bernard Cohn talks about South Asia. They have to, because they're teaching a modern audience, reaching a modern audience. So in the colonial period, there's a distinction between the history writing, which is South Asia, and the evidence, which is all about India. It says India, it doesn't mean India, because there's no idea about present-day India. So it's just one of those many instances in which the same word is used for two different things, but only in that period. So the history section is very much longer than just the colonial one. And even in the colonial, or rather even in the nationalist part of the colonial one, we can talk specifically about the nationalisms of, like Bengal or Orissa or Sri Lanka or Nepal or whatever, these countries are called that now, but they weren't called that then. They were regions or cultural formations or whatever, but they were not nation states. So either we have to go with all nation states or we have to go with none. And in that period, there were no nation states. There were only empires, that's it, and cultural regions, and language regions. So those are different kinds of distinctions that one can make. And, I don't think we have to worry about professional historians coming to it. There's enough of a debate among them also. So it's not that they are consensual on this.
Nita, I wanted to ask you about nation-state India. In the context of the development of the new education policy, I've heard people talk about, I know you glossed over their slide about the Gandhian phase and, what would it have looked like had we gone with Gandhian ideas of education. And then there's also people who made us all read The Bountiful Tree and say that indigenous, which is very important, and we haven't got it right. Even those who wanted to indigenize our education haven't got it right. So I wanted to ask your opinion about these two kinds of knowledge, and going ahead, how you see us trying to indigenize education, if at all we want to. To those who want to indigenize education, what would your advice be?
What was very precious about the indigenous system was its decentralization. That's a message that really has to be carried forward. Because I don't think you can teach well if you don't teach rooted in the locality, your immediate neighborhood, city or village. That should be the fount of motivation and inspiration for your curriculum and for the teaching of your students to make the lessons in school relate to their lives. Apart from the fact that, of course, everyone needs fantasy and everyone needs fairy tales and things that don't exist anywhere at any time, that's another important part of the curriculum, but one part definitely has to be the local. So that was very important in the indigenous system. The other thing which was very important, which should be carried over, is this combination, as I said, not separation of knowledge into this, but bridging over the boundaries to say it can be vocational, but part of the vocational is this liberal arts or ethical, as they called it. So say a merchant's son was actually taught specifically in what's called Bahi Khata, keeping accounts, that form of keeping accounts. But if you read any description of that education, it's not just keeping accounts as in the course on accounting, it's like what does it mean to keep accounts? What is the value of your keeping accounts? What should be your status in the community, because your Bahi or Khata will be so respected in a court of law. Just your signature is enough. There are all kinds of ethical things. And then they went into the history and the sociology of it and all kinds of things. That is very important in indigenous education, which went away with colonial education. So the contrast really is between colonial and indigenous. In the colonial period, there was a little widening of the availability of it. But at the same time, actually children were essentialized as they weren't before. So either you failed or you succeeded. If you failed, you were a certain kind of a child. It wasn't that it was a failure of the system or the school or the teacher or anything like that. But in the indigenous system, yes, there was a narrow scope and people usually studied separately, but it was really the responsibility of the teacher. And the teachers were judged by their students. There was no way that a teacher could get away by saying, oh, this child is like this. And that continues today in the music education thing, for instance. I've never heard, and I've studied this intensively, a music commentator or teacher criticize a student for their innate ability. It will only be he doesn't do enough riyaz, he doesn't do enough practice. That means he could do it if he wanted. And they keep saying, I can work as hard with you as you like, but you're going to have to do the practice, you know? So these are very, very core ideas of the indigenous system. It's not any one practice that we should look at, but some of these core ideas, which are what I described in the beginning as the relationship of the knowledge and the student and the teacher and the larger society. You know, those relationships are what, if we could, would be lovely to retrieve. And you said the other thing was about Gandhi. I think there's a problem with Gandhi's ideas because he was extremely radical, which is a great thing. You should be ready to break down anything, discard anything which doesn't work. It didn't work for him. It didn't work for Tagore. Colonial education worked for neither of them. So they were willing to discard the two. Tagore worked much more specifically on teaching. He worked in the school, he taught in the classroom. Gandhi didn't do any of this. So I'll just say, as a practitioner, that if you don't yourself stand in the classroom and teach students and then observe them, you actually may not have a right to talk about how they should be taught, you know? And there are other problems also.
Well, it's already 17 and we don't need to get this guy.
Regarding the introductory definitional parts that you suggested to use, I would tend to agree with what Professor Padma just mentioned, that it is going to be, I think, problematic with the current use that you have suggested in terms of a whole region that may be seen as a little different from what we might see as India. Because it's large space, as some of our friends have already said. Of course, there are similarities and common strands in historical teachings and practices in our countries. As Dr. Pramod mentioned, I mean, Maldives certainly was had Buddhist traditions until the 12th century. And we had our own language, our own script, and our teachings. But it took a Persian learned person and a trader to arrive in Maldives in the middle of 12th century and convince the king at the time to convert to Islam. And since then, we have never looked back. We have remained a Muslim country for the last 800 plus years. And since then, I mean, we have had the traditions, the fusion of traditions, as Professor Samuel said. I mean, some of the traditions are I mean, culturally not necessarily Islamic, but there's a fusion there. So some of the teachings and practices are same, but I think the definition appears to be a bit reductionist if you use the in India definition. So I would suggest to reconsider or perhaps explain it more, because it could be problematic as far as I see.
I think this is in line with what has been already mentioned. I think when we say India, I think I would also support that, because I think if you look at the history, for instance, with my little knowledge about the history, you know, for instance, Bhutan has never been under the British colonial rule. And then if you look at the history of our education system, you know, of course, the modern education, of course, is greatly influenced by the Indian education system. But if you look at the past, the education system that existed in the past were influenced from Tibet. So that way, if you look at the nation state, I think Bhutan became the monarchy in 1907, which is much earlier than 1947. So that way, if you refer to this India, I think I would agree that I think there's some problem. So maybe I think it will be good to use a neutral term rather than mentioning it as India.
I actually, that first slide, you can just forget about it. Nowhere in anything that I write will you have any problem or any cause for discomfort because that's, the historical record. And it doesn't cover every single part separately. It can't be done. So it talks with broad brushstrokes, and it's up to all the different countries' authors to mention their own particular history, because obviously we don't have so many chapters in my section to cover everyone's history, right? So this is the record of history as it exists. And forget about the name. We'll call it whichever name sounds best. And it's not even that slide has no place in it. I just threw it in because I thought one person had discomfort, and I was very surprised when Padma said, "Oh, I hope this will cover all of South Asia, not India." I said, it's not about India. Actually, South Asia was called India. That's all it was. That's how I dismissed it. And then I just put in that slide. Unfortunately, it's generated a lot of discussion, which took away from what I thought were the interesting parts. So I hope you'll come back to that and forget this thing. Thank you.